We are moving on to speaking about leases and property management. And one thing I kind of want to start off with before we get into the content is I get a lot of feedback from students when they go to take the exam that they had a lot more leasing and property management questions than they expected. You should just have a couple on the national and then a couple on the state. I think the reason that it comes across as more is you got to keep in mind you might have a question about a lease that's actually a contracts question. Because remember, a lease is a type of contract, or you might have something around property management, creating a relationship with a landlord or property owner that's really about agency. So I think that's why it seems like it shows up a little bit more. But this is the specific content that will be tested for the exam. So here's some definitions around it. So the lease for a rental between a property owner and a tenant. There are four basic types of leases: an estate for years, an estate from period to period, an estate at will, and an estate at sufferance. An estate for years is going to be a lease that has a hard start date and a hard end date. It could be for days, weeks, months, years, but it's got a hard start and a hard stop. So there's no need for the tenant to give any sort of notice, because when the lease ends, it ends. An estate from period to period might be what a lot of you are familiar with if you've ever rented an apartment, and you might have even called it a month-to-month lease instead of period to period. It's going to be indefinite. And while you might have a 1-year lease, January 1st to December 31st, there's a clause with it that says in order for it to end on the 31st, you must give a 30-day notice. And if you don't, then you're going to be paying the next year of January rent until you give a 30-day notice. It's going to continue to month. That's a period to period lease. Estate at will is an indefinite period. Again, this can run days, weeks, months, years, but it basically says it goes on indefinitely for the tenant, the landlord gives notice to one another. And then an estate reference is the lease is up for this, maybe even a estate for years. The lease is up, but the tenant continues to stay there, right? So they're supposed to be gone and they're not. They're there with the property or the landlord's with their permission. A few other types of leases that are kind of unique. I'm going to point out a couple of these. With a ground lease, oil and gas lease, lease purchase, and the sale back lease. Ground leases may not be common, but I do actually know of several lake communities here throughout the state that work on a ground lease. So someone owns the ground and then they allow you to build a house on it for it's a very long period of time. And I'm not sure why exactly they always set it up like that. But I believe Sudden Valley, and I've heard maybe Diamond Head Lake, have a few properties like that. So when you buy it, the property probably seems really, really cheap, or inexpensive might be a better word. But really it's because you don't own the land with it. You just own the improvement. Oil and gas leases allow for exploration of subsurface minerals. A lease purchase could be another way to do a rent to own. And then a sale and lease back would be when a property owner sells and then they lease it back from the new owner. And this I've seen happen with maybe a business that has gotten a great offer from another investor to move their business. This new investor wants this prime location. So what would happen would be this business would sell their property to a new owner and then lease it back for maybe 3 years while they wrap up their business and find another location to maybe take their manufacturing facility or something like that. Here is another couple of questions that I think you've got a good opportunity for having on the exam around leases. And this is the gross, net, and percentage lease. A gross lease is probably, again, what a lot of you are familiar with if you've ever rented an apartment. This will be a type of lease that goes along with that period to period or month to month lease. And this is where the tenant pays a fixed amount of rent plus some utilities like their cable, water, personal insurance for their personal belongings, and gas, electric. But the landlord pays maintenance of the property, property taxes, and exterior maintenance. And this is often used for residential or commercial leases. A net lease is when the tenant pays everything, their utilities, their rent, plus the property taxes and insurance and any maintenance that goes along with it. This is very common for commercial or industrial leases, and you might be thinking, why? Why would a business take on all those extra expenses? Well, this works really well for, I think, long-term leases, because then it allows the business that's renting to get the tax deductions for that insurance and taxes and maybe some of the maintenance. That could be a good business perspective for them. Percentage lease is where I think you've got a good shot of having an exam test question. And this works really well in a lot of retail spaces. So think the mall. Some of these may pay a set amount of rent every month, but the idea of it is they're paying a percentage of their gross income as a rent, which means your months that you maybe have higher sales, like towards the holidays, you're going to pay a higher rent than in February where maybe sales are lower. So it's really the concept that the mall manager needs to be bringing in businesses that are highly profitable, because that's what allows the mall overall to be profitable as well. So a great question around this would be, if you've got a booming business that wants to open a second location in your commercial space, how are you most likely to charge them rent? And the best answer is going to be a percentage lease, because you want to capture this booming business and all the money they're making in this second location. Next up on the list is creating and discharging leases.